Welcome to SEG Seismic Sound Off, conversations addressing the challenges of energy, water, and climate. I'm your host, Andrew Gary. In this episode, Patrick Meroney joins the podcast to highlight the urgency of aligning technology with business goals and pursuing change strategically to drive long-term success. Patrick discusses the risks of prioritizing tech over process, the power of data integration, and why companies must decide whether they're driven by innovation or efficiency. Patrick also shares practical advice for geophysicists navigating digital transformation. Whether you're grappling with legacy data, choosing new geophysical software, or balancing cost-effective operations with cutting-edge tools, Patrick's insights will help you optimize your approach and avoid common pitfalls. Please check out the show notes to find links to additional episodes highlighting the topics discussed in this episode. This episode is sponsored by Katalyst Data Management. Katalyst Data Management provides the only integrated end-to-end subsurface data management solution for the oil and gas industry. Its employees operate in North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, and South America, and are dedicated to optimizing the value of subsurface data, including seismic and well data. Katalyst enables clients' digital transformation of E&P data with digitizing services and digital transformation consulting. Learn more at its website, katalystdm.com. That's Katalyst with a K, dm.com. And now, here is my conversation with Patrick Meroney. So Patrick, I'm excited that you're joining the Seismic Sound Off podcast today. And one of your roles, not one, the role that you have at Katalyst Data Management is Vice President of North American Operations. And you've been deeply involved in helping companies manage their subsurface data more effectively. Could you just share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the geosciences and data management?
Sure. Well, like most people who, especially on the data management side, most people that have gotten involved in that in the oil and gas or subsurface world have kind of fallen into it. And that's sort of the same with me. I started my career in 1990 with Conoco, and I worked there for about 21 years, and I left for an opportunity to build up some information management capability at Repsol in the U.S., did that for a few years, and now I'm with Katalyst for the last 10 years. But yeah, I mean, I started out in business roles with ConocoPhillips, worked in upstream IT, worked in the global strategy group, but my background was really more on the business side. So I think people that have a propensity to value the data management and integration and technology, we end up being tasked with things because that's our passion, and data management is one of those things. So that's what's happened to me throughout my career.
Well, one of the things SEG has done I think starting before Image, but has continued with Image, is having these sessions on businesses, been a big focus of Image, of the business case and how the business side of geophysics. So it's kind of nice that you're here to talk about that focus. And, one of the things when you're evaluating new technology for subsurface data management, what are the key requirements geophysicists should focus on to ensure value for the business?
Well, I think one of the most important things they need to do is make sure they understand what their company wants to be good at. What's your company's or your business line strategy? Like, what problems are you trying to solve? Or, have you actually prioritized the requirements that you're building around and the value that they bring to the business? And is that value aligned with what your company wants to be good at? So you need to be thinking about how this technology will impact my workflows, and not just my one function, but the upstream and downstream workflows. So for example, I may be receiving data that's important to my workflow, but does this technology impact the way that others send me data? Or I may be feeding data to another piece downstream of my workflows, and maybe I have a mature, robust process for feeding downstream workflows already. Have I thought about how this new technology is going to impact those workflows? So you have to look kind of around you. You obviously want to solve the requirements that you have, but you also need to be aware of how they may impact the people either feeding you data or receiving data.
How often in your experience do you find companies kind of putting the cart before the horse, where companies are overlooking their strategic business goals when defining the technology requirements for geophysical projects?
It's hard to know how often specifically, but most of the time the requirements are focused on individual features, like exporting PVT data in a specific format compatible with some application or some other technology. So instead of looking at overall business process improvements, while it's possible that those business workflows and improvements have already been considered, my experience is that they're often overlooked, and definitely the change management processes that are associated with those workflows, they're rarely accurately estimated.
Hmm. Just to paint a little picture for us, what is the risk of overlooking that step of defining those business goals?
Well, the biggest risk is that your technology fails, not because of the technology, simply because you put technology ahead of the business processes. Still may be great technology, but you didn't build around it. And so it fails not because of the technology, but because the processes around it aren't working, which is a real shame because many times in my career, I've seen a really good technology that didn't work, not because of the technology, but just because nobody thought about the workflow processes to support it long term.
So, is that one of the first questions you will ask a prospective client? What are your business goals? Are you asked to receive them? Is that a typical part of your onboarding process?
Always, we always try to start with making sure that we're aligned with the business strategies. And sometimes, most of the time that's not a foreign conversation. Opening up that can is common. People want to talk about what their business processes are and how they're going to be affected and what the change management is, but not always. Sometimes we've had clients come to us and having conversations about the business workflows is not something they want to have. So it just depends really on who you're talking to and where they're positioned in the organization.
What role does digital transformation play in the subsurface data management?
Well, it's critical. If complete data, if you want to have a complete data set, if that's important to your analysis. But again, it depends on the goals of your company or your business. Sometimes data preservation can be the strategy until your company's ready to invest in digitalization. But regardless, the investment has to come ahead of any really innovative digital technologies.
Do you think that should be a mandatory requirement in requests for proposals for geophysical solutions?
I think it's a good idea. I don't think it's always a requirement, but because again, it depends on what you want to be good at. And plus, it depends on where your company is on its digital journey. I mean, your company may have made a conscious decision to say, we want to prepare, we want to get ready, but we're not ready and we won't be ready for another couple of years. And so you can help them prepare. And that doesn't always include digitalization. It may just include, being ready to attack digitalization when they're ready.
When anyone is looking at software or something new, you always have this like things you're really excited about and that are kind of nice to have, but then critical features that you need the software to do. How can geophysicists better prioritize those critical features versus those nice to have features when they're choosing software for these subsurface workflows?
A lot of times people don't like to hear it, but you really need to start with the governance discussion. And governance these days sometimes can be a scary word. It doesn't have to be, because I believe that governance should always be, fit for purpose. It doesn't have to be this big, painful, monolithic thing. It's really mainly just discussion around the big picture. So, you have to remember that great tech can't replace integrated business workflows, but it can certainly augment those. The big picture focuses on, discussing the overall impact, improvements, disruptions, uptake, change management. If you've taken the time to do the analysis of your gaps, maybe you found that fluid analysis, for example, is a missing link. If it makes sense to prioritize that, then do that. But again, if your requirements include gathering up and in most cases digitizing the fluid analysis reports and making it a necessary part of your workflows, I mean, it's not just enough to say, we need to do a better job of fluid analysis and incorporating geochemical data in our workflows. Have you thought about, do you have that data available? And if you don't, that needs to be part of your workflow as well, your objectives.
Can you share an example of a geophysical technology investment that enhanced the decision making or the operational performance?
In every digital transformation project that I've ever been a part of, there are examples. So it could be from discovering data that an asset team was about to reacquire to dramatically reducing the delivery time from weeks to minutes, sometimes months to minutes, and discovering insights that enhance, for example, low carbon project team decisions. So even the super exciting AI that we're seeing these days that come with large language models, things like Chat GPT, they need data digitally to work. So I don't know. I wouldn't say it's so much about a technology investment. It's more of an investment in modernization.
What are some of the biggest pitfalls geophysicists face when they're defining maybe overly broad or overly specific, even technology requirements?
Well, when it's too broad, they're likely trying to solve the world's problems or boiling the ocean, sometimes people call it. But when it's too narrow, they're trying to be too specific and they're spending too much effort on a niche solution that may not have a value to the overall enterprise. So it's a balance. And don't get me wrong, occasionally the very specific niche requirements can be the game changer for their business. So you really have to evaluate every instance on its own merits.
What are kind of some general tips to avoid those mistakes on the front end before they talk to someone like yourself?
I think there are some simple things you can do. I mean, one of the things I've always tried to do is put in just a simple weighting measurement in your requirements building process. So it's where you make a conscious decision to review each of the requirements and how those requirements are actually going to improve your business capability or efficiency. Oftentimes that improvement's based on a program and not the components of the program. So what I mean by that is you can say that, overall, we're going to improve our finding capability and lower our finding costs, but you don't really identify whether those specific requirements each actually add up to improving those business capabilities. So I think you need to take a lean approach to your requirements building. You need to look at probably down a level and make sure that, because typically there's a lot of requirements when you're putting in new solutions, technology solutions, and a lot of times the aggregate of those requirements is what is looked at instead of the individual requirements to see if they really add value.
How does a lack of integration between the various technical workflows like geochemistry and earth modeling, for example, impact the decision making and efficiency in geophysics?
Good question. And I think you can pick any two workflows, really. Pick any two workflows that are executed by different people or different functions within an asset. I mean, we're still working primarily in siloed functional organizations and not integrated asset teams. So it's a challenge. But I don't think you should think about it like technical data integration first. You should think about the integration of the functional inputs and outputs, meaning, are you organizationally ready to do those things? So can your petrophysicist easily send data to your geophysicist to enhance the model? I mean, forget about the technology aspect right now, but organizationally, are you set up to do that? I mean, that's the first question. So it's funny to think that that's the issue, but we've been living in this siloed functional organizations for a long time. They're not getting less siloed, they're getting more siloed. So organizationally fit is one of the things you need to think about first. And then the technology is really easy. Once you're set up with humans to do the work, then you can throw the technology at it and the data to make sure that those flows are mapped and that they're actually flowing through your organization efficiently.
I imagine a conversation you have a lot is balancing, this cutting edge geophysical technology you may offer with cost effective operations. How do you talk to companies about that, of balancing those two sides, particularly in the upstream sector?
I don't think that there's a playbook that works for every single company. I think it's dependent on each company and, again, what the company wants to excel at. But I will say in general, when you invest in geophysical technology, especially when you're still trying to grow your portfolio, you build your reserves, add to your drillable inventory, all those upstream things, and especially when you're trying to grow while also controlling costs, because that seems to be the model that we've been in forever, right? We want to be innovative, we want to grow, but we also want to reduce our costs. We want to be top tier at finding costs. So in other words, just because you've identified areas, in your example, it's geophysics, where you need to improve, you use technology, and you should invest in technology or modernization actually because you want to lower your finding costs. That doesn't always or even usually mean reducing your cost. It's actually more effective if you're improving your denominator. So that's one of the things we talk about is what's the denominator here? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to build more reserves? So if you really want to build to the bottom line, sometimes you have to spend money to do that. And that's what we talk to them about.
Yeah, that's a good thing. There's two sides of that equation, and you could improve either one of those sides. How does the quality and the accessibility of subsurface data impact the effectiveness of tools used for things like reservoir characterization and earth modeling?
Yeah, good. Another good question. And it sounds kind of like an easy question, but it's actually one of the most difficult questions, especially the quality part. There's so much variability around that. And again, it gets back to your governance and how much you as a company want to spend in that space. So let me start first with the accessibility because that's a little easier to answer. So I think humans and computers agree that the more information you have, the better. And so accessibility is key to both human impacts and the technology. They want all the data all the time, but a lot of times that data is locked up in a box in a warehouse. It's not adding any value. So that's why we talk about digitalization. So accessibility is important, especially as you move along your maturity line. And that there's a pretty easy way to address that just through digitalization projects. Quality is a little bit harder to do because the biggest issues with quality are around assumptions and documenting those assumptions. And what I mean by that is, you may make a conscious effort to ignore some quality issues or to throw out. So think about like you're grading petrophysical data, zonal analysis, and you're finding some outliers. You have two things that you can do. You can spend a lot of time digging into why you have those outliers and rationalizing whether they should be thrown out or not, or just throw them out. And a lot of times you just throw them out. You say, okay, these outliers are affecting my interpretation. They're, in my experience, they're most likely not valid. So I'm going to cut those outliers out. Okay. That's a valid thing that happens all the time. The problem with that is that you haven't told anybody really that's what you've done. And so I think from a quality perspective, one of the things that we're seeing right now is something called technical assurance. And so it's really the ability to document the decisions that you've made, because even though today you may not have a detective that can go in and do the work to see if that was a good decision, you may have that detective in the future. And so if that person can do that analysis to say, this is why you took that decision, and again, that's called technical assurance, then I think that's, from a quality perspective, that's the best improvement that you can make. So we're seeing some things. I don't know. We didn't talk about OSDU in this conversation, and that's probably because that's a whole nother series of podcasts. But there are things, platforms like OSDU that are building out more capability in technical assurance, and I think that's really where we are in the industry today. Is from a quality perspective, we're focused in that space.
Yeah, we'll link to a conversation we had earlier on OSDU a little bit more in depth that people can listen to as well. What key considerations should geophysicists weigh when deciding whether to implement an enterprise-wide solution for subsurface data versus maybe a more modular, specialized tools approach?
I think you need to identify how your company feels about innovation versus efficiency or low cost. Know who you are, right? Know who your company is. Is your company about innovation, or is it about enterprise and efficiency? If your company's about innovation and they put their money where their mouth is, then you should go best in class or build around your humans and the tools that make them cost effective and the technology to integrate across systems and platforms. Because if you go best in breed or best in class, you're going to have to spend money on integration. Because those are going to be boutique tools in some cases, and you're going to have to take their inputs and outputs and integrate them with your organization. But that may be where your company's at. Your company may say, we're the most innovative company out there, and they really mean that they want to do that. But on the other hand, if your company values efficiency, which always really means scalability, then go with something that's more scalable, which means fewer overall solutions, less requirement for point-to-point interfaces or integration, less tools, probably means bigger software companies, which we won't mention. But I think the first thing you need to do is identify what kind of company you work for, because you're going to get frustrated if you work for a big company that says, we're all about enterprise efficiency and low cost, and they haven't shown a propensity to be super innovative. They made a conscious decision, and then if you are out there with your boots on the ground and you're saying, look, that's great, but I'm an innovator and I want to do these things, you may get blocked and you may get frustrated. So it's best to work within the confines of what your company's trying to do. I do want to come back to that at some point. We'll talk about how you can buck that system if you're a leader. I think it's important that we, just because your company may see things one way, that doesn't mean you should always just toe the line. Maybe there are reasons for you to step out and be a voice of change out there, but you have to do it a certain way.
Yeah, and have a certain role maybe in that particular organization. How should geophysicists approach the issue of legacy data and documents like fluid analysis reports when they're implementing new subsurface technologies?
Well, if your workflow includes doing some fluid analysis or PVT or core analysis, any kind of rock properties, then you should probably be very motivated to get your hands on legacy data that could be locked up in those boxes in a warehouse, the data that will be super valuable to your analysis, especially when we're thinking about things like AI and being able to put AI to work and use that data right away. Most of that data is probably not digital.
I like what you said throughout this conversation. There's no right or wrong. If you're more innovative, more efficient, low cost, that's fine, but you need to know who you are. That's important. And in your opinion, what is the most underrated technology or solution in the geophysics sector that more companies should be adopting to stay competitive, kind of no matter where they are maybe on that?
Well, that's a difficult question, Andrew. I think to me, I think one of the underrated technologies is really integration. And we've been talking about it here, right? And the siloed organizations and, the fact that we're not as tightly integrated as humans working in an asset as we'd like to be. We've had this problem for a long time and we don't seem to be making a ton of progress around it. But integrating of data between work streams, to me, is we can make improvements in that technology. We're going to make huge gains in our efficiency just through the handoffs between functions.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. We've been talking so much about multidisciplinary work and silos. I feel like I've heard for decade plus now, and it's interesting you say, it's not getting any better. The lessons are not being learned.
Yeah, well, I'll put a caveat on that. I think, again, without getting into a long discussion on OSDU, it's interesting that they're trying to solve that problem. They've said that issue around integration and bringing the applications to the data and the humans to the data instead of the other way around is really the promise and the business case for OSDU. And I love the fact that that's the case. It's still not solved yet. And for the most part, data is still moving around awkwardly, but at least there's been some recognition and some effort to address that. We'll have to just see if it's going to be successful.
What challenge would you like to leave the listener from this conversation?
I talked a little bit about it just a couple questions ago. I've been talking a lot about knowing what your company strategies are, who your company is, what they want to be, where they want to excel, and trying to work within those frameworks. But again, if you don't agree with those strategies, I think it's okay for you to be a voice or an advocate for change. Companies need leaders, and this may be one of the most important leadership criteria is identifying when you and your ship are going in the right direction. I'd say don't just rage against the machine though in the trenches by demanding things the company isn't going to advocate, like more innovation or more spending or more technology or more data, but speak up for these things as a catalyst for changing into the company that you want it to be and why you think those investments or changes are going to make a difference.
I'll ask just one follow-up question on something you mentioned. What would you recommend to someone maybe in a leadership role at a company who's maybe kind of the opposite of what, they're low cost, they want to be more innovative or vice versa? What kind of one or two steps would you recommend that person do to move the company forward?
Well, there's a couple things. The first important things are understanding what value that innovation that you advocate for is going to bring. It's not just this is good for me. It helps me make my job better, but how does it make the company better? If you can articulate how the company would be better by making these steps, and sometimes they can be small and incremental, but if you can articulate why that makes the overall company better, what moves the needle is if you can make your function, your company, your science better. That's what's going to make the difference. And I also would say, ultimately, if you just feel like it's a mismatch, like I'm a really innovative dude and I'm working for this big company that's never going to be that way. They have a track record of 100 years where they've always focused on efficiency, and make a change. I had one of my best mentors at Conoco when I was there was a general manager that worked in mid-continent, and he took me under his wing a little bit and basically asked me, what do you want to do with your career? And I said, look, I'm passionate around information management. I know everybody else, on the geoscience side probably thinks, what's wrong with this guy? But it's something I have a real passion about. I don't think we as an industry do it good. I want to improve it. We don't have competencies built around it. We don't train people up how to be good at it. So it's a passion that I had. And this mentor, this guy told me, look, if that's what you want to do, then you should go work for a data management company. And he wasn't trying to tell me to get out. He was trying to really mentor me. And that's what I did. And so I left and I went to work for a data management company. And I think it was the best move I ever made. So look, if you're an innovative person and you're not working for an innovative company, you can try to change it. And if you're not successful, then you should move to an innovative company.
Yeah. Don't spend your career just hitting your head against a wall. Absolutely not. Well, Patrick, I really appreciate your time and insight into this and sharing your wisdom of many years of working on this. And thanks so much.
All right, Andrew. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Seismic Sound Off. SEG creates these episodes to celebrate and inspire the geophysicists of today and tomorrow. Please follow this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be the first to hear new episodes. You can also subscribe to the podcast now on YouTube. If you have episode ideas or feedback for the show, or want to sponsor future episodes, email the show at podcast@seg.org. Andrew Gary of Treasurement hosted, edited, and produced this episode. The SEG podcast team comprises Jennifer Cobb, Kathy Gamble, and Allie McGinnis. This is Seismic Sound Off, signaling off.